there's been an obsession with colonialism, with economic impact of colonialism, the political impact of colonialism, the social impact of colonialism, and of course, on colonialism's other nationalism, the different forms of resistance to British authority, elite resistance, peasant resistance, workers' resistance, the great heroic figures of our freedom struggle, Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar, lesser currents, for example, those, or lesser known currents, for example, those associated with the revolutionary terrorists such as Bhagat Singh, the mystery of Subhash Bose. So whether you're dealing with colonialism or with nationalism, there's an extraordinary interest, obsession, manifested, of course, in popular discourse, but also in serious scholarly work. If you were to take the volumes of subaltern studies, which is the most influential movement of Indian historians, they published 10 volumes, about 80 articles. At least 70 are on the period from Plassey to partition. If you do a similar study of the PhD theses in the history departments of our best universities, such as JNU, you'll reach a similar conclusion. Now, in recent years, there's been a criticism of this obsession with colonialism and nationalism made by historians to the effect that this neglects the period before colonialism, which in fact was often very interesting and intriguing, the early modern period, the 16th and the 17th centuries. And there's been first-rate work over the last 8 or 10 years by historians writing on the 16th and the 17th centuries before the period of the British Raj. But I'm more concerned with what comes afterwards. It is true that the focus on colonialism and nationalism has led to the neglect of the pre-colonial period. But it's also led to a neglect by historians, in my view, perhaps even more serious, of the post-colonial period. And that's the point of departure for my essay. The paradox that while the Indian experience with democracy and nationhood is an extraordinarily rich and interesting and remarkable one, there's been so little written about this history, the Indian Revolution, as compared to the vast corpus of writings on, shall we say, the American or the French revolutions. So that's the paradox I'm starting with. Why is this so? Well, one of the reasons is that when you write about the recent past, as a scholar, you face a series of complicated challenges. And I'm going to share with you 4 major challenges to the contemporary historian. If I want to write about 1900 or 1500 or 500 AD, I don't face these challenges. What are the challenges that a contemporary historian faces? The first challenge is that the reader of his or her books is not a passive recipient of the text. If I was writing a book on the period of the Emperor Ashoka, you would approach it as a reader out of curiosity. You wouldn't have preformed opinions about what Ashoka stood for or what the Maurya stood for. On the other hand, when you write about the recent past, your reader has his or her own opinions, especially about political figures. Because we live with the consequences of decisions taken by modern politicians, we presume we know all about them. Now, the further back you go in the past, the less of a problem it is. I mentioned Ashoka, who is the subject of a wonderful recent biography by my friend and colleague, Professor Nainjot Lahiri. But Professor Lahiri has a great advantage over me, because when she speaks about Ashoka, no one in the audience is going to lecture her about Ashoka. Right. Now, that's the first challenge, that in the case of contemporary history, the reader is also a citizen, a critical citizen, with his or her own ideological and social preferences. Even before you offer them your history, they know all about it. You may write a 500-page book, replete with hundreds of footnotes based on your careful research. But they'll approach that text already knowing what this book about Nehru or Patel or Ambedkar or states reorganization or the unification of India is all about. So that's the first challenge, that your reader, the first challenge to the contemporary historian, that the reader, the potential reader, has her own very strongly entrenched views and prejudices even before she opens your book. The second challenge is that the historian is also a citizen. You know, when I write about Nehru or Ambedkar or Patel, when I write about partition, when I write about the India-China War of 1962, when I write about the Andhra movement of 1953, or the anti-Hindi agitation of the DMK in Madras in 1965, I also have certain perceptions or misperceptions because I've read about it, I've discussed it. So, which is very unlikely to be the case if I'm writing as a historian about the distant past. So the reader has his or her prejudices. The historian also is not completely blank when writing about the recent past. The third challenge is the density of sources. One of the reasons that there's so much work on the colonial period is that the British were obsessive record keepers. And they kept most of their files. Our governments either don't keep files or shred them. Right, before they demit office, they shred them. Or even if they keep them and do not shred them, they don't transfer it to the National Archives. So if you go to the National Archives or to a state archive anywhere, you know, you go to the West Bengal State Archive in Kolkata, you go to the Maharashtra State Archive in Mumbai, you go to UP State Archive in Lucknow, all places I have worked, and you look at their records. The records are overwhelmingly of the colonial period. They're 18th and 19th century records. And a historian needs primary sources to work with. So one of the reasons there's so much work on the colonial period is that the material is all there. Whereas for the recent past, the sources are scanty, imperfectly kept, and sometimes not available at all. And let me give the example again of Nehru. Nehru wrote a great deal. His private papers are in the control of his family. Only 5 scholars, 3 foreigners and 2 Indians, have been allowed to consult them. I am not one of them. Indira Gandhi's papers are closed completely. No one has ever seen them. Vajpayee's papers, no one knows whether they exist or not. Whereas in most democratic countries, the papers of retired or dead politicians are properly archived, properly filed, and made accessible to scholars. And I'm talking here about papers that deal with their political life. If I want to study Nehru, I want to study him as a politician, as a prime minister. I'm not interested in his romantic relationships. I'm happy if you close the Lady Mountbatten papers. But not only are the Lady Mountbatten papers closed, so will be the Kashmir and the China papers. Likewise with Vajpayee. You know, Vajpayee was an immensely charming man, had romantic relationships. I'm not interested in that because I don't think that affected his prime ministership. But his other papers would also be closed. So Indians are paranoid about records. So records are scarce, and this is compounded by the fact that Indians are paranoid about records. And of course, we live in a climate, a monsoonal climate, where records disintegrate too. So that's challenge number 3. Challenge number 1, the reader is an engaged, excessively engaged reader. Challenge number 2, the historian of contemporary India is more prejudiced himself than a historian of ancient India. Challenge number 3, the sources are scanty compared to earlier periods. And the challenge number 4, which is a peculiarly Indian challenge and has to do with the definition of disciplinary boundaries in an Indian university. When the clock struck midnight on 15th August 1947, history ended and political science began. Right, okay. So historians don't deal with the post-47 period because that's the province of the political scientists. Incidentally, I don't know, many people in this audience may not know that I have never done a degree in history, which maybe I can't get a job in JNU, but I can still write books. Because I didn't do a degree in history, my degrees are in economics and sociology, I was able to work from the first book I ever wrote, which was a history of forestry in the Himalaya. It started in the 1890s and ended in the 1970s. Because, you know, this conception that on 15th August history ended 1947 and political science began. Fortunately, I wasn't burdened by this. But most historians are. If you're a sociologist and you go, or a political scientist, and you go to your supervisor and say, I want to work on 19th century constitutionalism, your supervisor will say that is history. If you're a historian and you go to your supervisor and say, I want to work on the tribals in Bastar in the 1960s, they will say that is anthropology or political science. So this is a real genuine problem that is apart from the other problems. The other problems are universal. If I was an American historian writing about the 1960s, the Vietnam War, I would face the problem of an engaged reader, the problem of an engaged scholar, and the lack of density of sources. But I wouldn't face this ridiculous problem where the difference between one discipline and another is determined by a single date. Now, these are four reasons, four challenges to the writing of contemporary history in India, and four reasons why, compared to the vast corpus of books on the colonial period, there are so few serious historical works on contemporary history. For example, if you consider the two themes that define the history of independent India since 1947 till today, if I was to look at two sociological categories, two words that capture our history, our complicated and tortuous history, more succinctly than any other words, these two words would be caste and elections. Caste and elections. We have had 16 gendered elections, countless state elections. It is universally acknowledged that amidst all the malfunctioning or dysfunctioning or non-functioning governmental institutions, the Election Commission holds free and fair elections. It is acknowledged that caste is a salient feature of Indian life. And this acknowledgement of the importance of elections and the importance of caste is felt by political scientists and anthropologists. So every election since 1952 has been carefully studied by political scientists. Anthropologists have done field work on caste in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, in the 2000s. But there's not a single book on changes in the caste system since 47, which are profound and very interesting. There's not a single book on how, since 1952, when we held our first elections, what have been the changes in forms of electoral financing, forms of election campaigning, changes in the party system, changes across India in the way in which different regions have voted or not voted. So we do not have a historian's diachronic perspective on either caste or on education or on election, even though these are the two most important aspects of our daily life as Indians. We do not have biographies of our key figures. You know, we do have, for example, books on Nehru or on Patel, but we don't have books on some remarkable individuals in independent India. Take the leaders of states. Take a person like Sheikh Abdullah. Sheikh Abdullah was identified with the history of Kashmir from 1946 till his death 40 years, 50 years, more than 40 years later. You cannot understand the history of modern Kashmir or the history of India or the history of Pakistan without Sheikh Abdullah. There is no good scholarly biography of Sheikh Abdullah. Think of a person like E.M.S. Namboodiripad in Kerala, or Fizo, the great Naga leader, or Master Tara Singh, the famous Akali leader. The history of Punjab is deeply interwoven till today with the legacy of Tara Singh. The history of Nagaland cannot be understood without what Fizo did or did not do. But there are no biographies of these people. Because we say these are provincial leaders. But the province is as large as a European country. Not to have a biography of E.M.S. Namboodiripad or of Y.B. Chavan of Maharashtra, another remarkable figure in our post-independence history. Not to have a biography of Y.B. Chavan is like not having a biography of Charles de Gaulle, and you're French. To be a Maharashtrian and not have a solid scholarly assessment of what Chavan meant for the history of Maharashtra, or what Morarji Desai meant for the history of Gujarat and India is really a massive deficiency in our historical knowledge. And if you move from politics to the arts, there's no biography of M.A. Subbalakshmi, of M.F. Hussain, of Ravi Shankar. I'm not talking about gossipy works by people who are in and around them. I'm talking about serious scholarly stuff. Of the great Kannada writer Shivaram Karant, one of my own favorites. Of business. The only biography of J.R.D. Tata is written by a chamcha. That be true of the biography of M.S. Oberoi or anyone else. The only good scholarly book on a businessman is Meda Malik's book on G.D. Birla, published by the Oxford University Press. So whether it be politics, whether it be the arts, whether it be business, whether it be sport, we don't have biographies. Now, if you look at the history of Bengal since the 1940s, it's an incredibly interesting history. You had the backdrop of partition. In the 50s, you had refugee resettlement, which led to the rise of left politics. In the 60s, you had famine, food scarcity, Naxalism. In the 70s, you had the emergency. In the 80s, you had the rise of the left front and Panchayati Raj. In the 90s, you had the complicated debates about, economic liberalization. In the 2000s, you had the major challenge to the left front through the Trinamool Congress. Accompanying these political and economic challenges, there were a whole host of literary and artistic activities. In the 50s, you had Satyajit Ray. In the 60s, you had Minal Sen. You had, in the 70s and 80s, you had writers like Mahashweta Devi. You had musicians. Would you, as a Bengali, want to read a good history of Bengal since 1947? You will find at least 50 or 100 good histories of France since 1947. You will find 500 theses on colonial Bengal. The Bengalis, like the rest of us, are obsessed with the colonial period. And Bengal produces the most historians, and all of them only write about colonialism. And I don't mean to single out the Bengalis. I come from Karnataka. We've also had a fascinating history. The 50s was a movement when we created a unified state from 4 parts. In the 60s, we had land reforms. In the 70s, we had the rise of the Dalit movement, which is very important in Karnataka, unlike in West Bengal. In the 80s, you had the first glimmerings of the IT movement. You had linguistic conflicts. Then you had, of course, the famous disputes with Tamil Nadu. I would like, as a resident of Karnataka, to have a good book that allows me to understand the history of my state since its formation in 1956. And each of our states, I'd like to underline, are like large European countries. We don't have them. We don't have good histories of economic policy, of foreign policy, of entertainment. Now, the question is, can these histories be written? Of course they can. Although government sources are closed, there are other kinds of sources. The Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, which is my home away from home, and which is where I spend my days when I'm in Delhi and have done for the last 30 years, has some 800 collections of private papers. It has newspapers, which are an incredibly valuable primary source from all over India. In the Nehru Museum, you will get Bengali newspapers from the 50s, Kannada newspapers from the 60s, Urdu newspapers from the 70s. So even if government sources are closed, the private papers of many individuals are open, the newspapers are available, court records are often a valuable source, oral histories, the closer you come to the past. If you're studying the 1960s, you can conduct oral histories. So you can, you do have the sources to write fine contemporary histories. And some of these are being written. I'll just single out a few books that have been published over the last 5 or 10 years, which will give you a sense of the kind of histories that can be written. And some of these books are the product of a foundation I'm associated with, the New India Foundation, which that was set up to promote research and writing on contemporary Indian history. There's a wonderful book by a journalist called Harish Damodaran called India's New Capitalists. It was published by Palgrave Macmillan some years ago and by Permanent Black. It's probably still available. I'll tell you what it does. It is a history of the deepening of India's business community after independence. Traditionally, most businessmen in India come from the Banya community and from family-owned businesses. But from the 60s and 70s, new kinds of people started entering the entrepreneurial class. Most importantly, farmers who had benefited from the Green Revolution turned their hand to agriculture, to industry. So that you had the Marathas of Western India starting sugar mills. You had the Gaundas, who are a peasant caste of Tamil Nadu, starting textile mills. Tirupur, which is the banyan capital of the world. All the factories are run by Gaundas, who are a peasant caste. In Kerala, you had Iravas, who are traditionally untouchable, taking to entrepreneurship. In Agra, the Chamars, also traditionally untouchable, started leather industries. So across southern and western India, you had the deepening of the business community by the entrance of new kinds of players or middle class people. Infosys was set up by people from families which have no business background at all. But this did not happen in northern India, in Punjab and in Haryana, where the Green Revolution was extremely successful. Somehow you didn't have a transformation of peasants into capitalists. Business remained in a stranglehold of the Banyas. Now this is a fascinating book which weaves in the history of the Green Revolution with the changing forms of industrialization in India. It tells you a great deal about modern India. A second book, and then I'll move on, is a book called The Gita Press and the Making of Modern India, written by a person called Akshay Mukul. And it's a fascinating account of a press called the Gita Press, based in Gorakhpur, which publishes editions of the Gita, religious literature, calendars, and for many years ran a very influential Hindi magazine called Kalyan, which defined what is the ideal Hindu woman, what she can or cannot do, what is the ideal Hindu man, how India or Hindus can become great again. I mean, the entire ideological and cultural infrastructure of the Hindutva movement was created by the Gita Press and its publications. And Akshay Mukul, for the first time, provides a subterranean intellectual and publishing history of a very influential political and ideological movement in independent India. But I hope and I think that these prejudices are slowly going to be, how do I put it, dismantled, changed, and we will begin to have the kind of attention paid to our recent history, to our complicated recent history, that this history deserves. I began by saying that India is the most interesting country in the world. I made that claim before. Some of you may be familiar with it. I would want to underline that when I say India is the most interesting country in the world, I mean to say, I do not mean to make a chauvinist or jingoist claim. It's a factual remark. India can also be the most exasperating country in the world, the most disgusting country in the world. If I was a woman, I would rather live in Sweden or Norway, where I would be treated with dignity, than here. If I was a working class person, likewise. But why is India the most interesting country in the world? India is the most interesting country in the world because it is both an unnatural nation and an unlikely democracy. Never before in human history was a territory so large, so diverse, so disparate, sought to be consolidated as a single political unit, and never before in human history was a population largely poor, largely illiterate, granted the vote. And India is undergoing, as I argue in my book, Bakers of Modern India, India is undergoing 5 simultaneous revolutions. The political revolution, whereby from a society based on the power of a feudal elite, now every citizen has a vote. A national revolution, whereby from a nation ruled by a foreigner, you have got Swaraj. An industrial revolution, whereby an economy largely based on agriculture is becoming more industrial. An urban revolution, whereby settlement patterns based on the village are becoming more and more city-based, and finally a social revolution, where traditional hierarchies, particularly of caste and gender, are being challenged and undermined. And India is undergoing these 5 revolutions simultaneously, unlike other countries. In other countries in the world, these revolutions were staggered. America had its national revolution in 1776, when they declared independence from the British colonialists. America had its urban and industrial revolution in the 19th century, its political revolution in the 18th century, its urban and industrial revolution in the 19th century, and its social revolution only in the 20th century. In fact, it was only as late as the 1960s that African Americans got the right to vote. So we're extraordinarily large, we're extraordinarily diverse, and we are undergoing these 5 revolutions. I mean, that's why India is the most interesting country in the world, and that's why, as a historian, I'm privileged to be born in India. I mean, I could spend 5 lifetimes writing about these 5 revolutions. So, India is the most interesting country in the world. It's the most daring, the most reckless political experiment in human history, and it is our country, which is why we need to know more about it, much more about it, than we do so far. Thank you very much.